Alright gang, today we'll be talking about the American Revolution, and it makes sense to start with what a terrible mismatch this actually was. The British had an organized and disciplined army, with trained, quality professional soldiers, a tradition of leadership, they had innovative tactics, they had the world's largest navy, over 400 warships, they had vast diplomatic resources, the ability to reach out to other countries and negotiate terms to keep them out of the war. They had financial strength, with a good banking system, they had a good industrial base, keeping in mind the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the 1750s, and they had the world's greatest empire. The Americans had none of those things. They had no real proven army, no good proven military leadership, no tradition to speak of, no navy. In fact, they had 55 ships total, not warships, 55 ships. By the end of the war, about 3 of those will still be around. They have no established currency, no industrial base, no diplomatic resources, and no real true colonial unity. What they do have is the ability to recruit an army. Washington will recruit a serviceable army that is supplemented by the militia. The militia serves as a home guard, and they augmented the forces of the regular army, but they weren't terribly reliable, and they tended to go away when harvest time came. The regular army, on the whole, was well trained, but they were citizen soldiers. They were not professionals. Most of them were native-born and poor. Many of them were immigrants or indentured servants. Very few were experienced in combat, and a lot of them found camp life debilitating, so desertions were very common. The size of Washington's army would fluctuate between 5,000 and 20,000 over the course of the war, and Washington was always fighting to keep conscriptions coming. With that said, the colonials did have certain advantages over the British. They were fighting on their home turf, which meant that they knew the landscape, they had shorter supply lines, and they were able to keep supplies of food and ammo coming whenever they could scrounge them up. They also had a cause worth fighting for. One of the things the British are going to really suffer from is a lack of commitment to the cause back home. They have proven political leadership. Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, a number of these guys will go on to become major leaders when the Republic first starts, but these guys are going to provide solid leadership over the course of the war. They have better communication lines, and they have better propaganda, again, kind of supplanting this cause to fight for and making sure that the colonists stayed on board with the cause. And finally, while Britain has the greatest empire in the world, they've also made a lot of enemies. And while France in particular will take a while to really get on board publicly with the American Revolution, almost immediately, France and Spain and the Dutch will start sending resources to the United States or to the colonial cause. Let's go ahead and check in on the fighting, starting in April of 1775.
Then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan. So British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the rebels time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British split up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more Patriot rebels kept showing up, and this time it was the British who were outnumbered as more fighting kicked off in Concord. The most professional army in the world was forced to flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen. And all along the British route back to Boston, Patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British. When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city. And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, 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 I'm in charge. This went on for some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home, and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch. What the fuck? Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George. Dude. Uncool. So Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back. The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400. The colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war, and they were ready for it. But one thing they weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George saying, "Hey man, looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends. I'm gonna kick your ass." Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure? Just do it. What does it say? He's gonna lick my... Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small engagements continued to occur around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of Patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During this time, there was also minor fighting going on between Patriot and Loyalist militias in the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack. The Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeated and pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental Army surrounding Boston. Boom. Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now, they could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the ideas of others. Instead, the Continentals worked through the night, setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city, and when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate, and Washington had his first victory of the war. Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls, and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard, writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later, independence actually came into effect. The United States of America was born. There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, it was treason, and if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York. Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for an attack to come. But the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while building their own strength. At one point, they launched a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind, and when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day. Washington's butt was sufficiently kicked. Winter was here. His troops' morale was low, some just up and left. Washington needed to do something, anything to restore faith in the revolution. The British had spread throughout New Jersey and settled in for a winter of drinking cider and partying hard. Nobody expected an attack in the winter, so Washington started making plans for an attack in the winter. The British had hired a large force of Hessian mercenaries from the German states of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau to fight the rebels. It was these mercenaries that were stationed across the Delaware River from Washington and his army. And there were more Hessian reinforcements incoming, but they made an unscheduled stop because their commander got thirsty. No, not that kind of thirsty. That kind of thirsty. It was Christmas Eve with a blizzard outside when Washington heard the Hessian defenses were down, and he decided to attack. He made a perilous crossing of the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men and marched 9 miles to Trenton, where he caught the Hessian forces completely off guard. After a short but fierce battle, the Hessians surrendered in droves. It was a much-needed victory that sent a clear message, not only to the British, but to Americans across the colonies. The war was far from lost. General Cornwallis led the British forces south to counterattack the Americans, but in a series of battles, Washington's defensive positioning and flanking maneuvers defeated the British 3 times in 10 days, and the British decided to abandon southern New Jersey for the rest of the winter. Washington finally set up a winter camp in Morristown, but for the Americans, there was much less partying than the British. Elsewhere, the British had taken Newport, Rhode Island, because it was a good naval base. In the south, they failed to take Charleston, South Carolina, which left British loyalists unsupported and vulnerable to more harassment and even mass expulsion. Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France on a mission to convince them to join the war, and while the French generally loved any opportunity to hoodwink the Brits, they didn't want to join unless it was a sure win. So for now, Franklin spent his days chilling out and chasing tail. The British Parliament couldn't believe the war wasn't over yet, and the pressure was on to end it. So the British came up with a plan. General Burgoyne in Montreal and General William Howe in New York would advance through the Hudson Valley and meet in the middle, splitting the colonies in two, and thus screwing over the American communication lines. Burgoyne began his movement south, and after taking Fort Ticonderoga quite easily, he then came across heavy American resistance, so he sent Howe a dingle-dongle asking if he'd be showing up anytime soon. Meanwhile, Howe had completely abandoned the plan and gone for all-out personal glory by capturing the American capital, Philadelphia. He defeated Washington and his army at Brandywine Creek by using the old hit him with a decoy and flank him from behind tactic, and Philadelphia was now in British hands, forcing Congress to escape to York. But Burgoyne was left on his own to face the ever-increasing American force in Saratoga. American General Horatio Gates teamed up with our old friend Benedict Arnold to deal one final blow to Burgoyne's army. Arnold wanted to take the fight to the British, but Gates wanted to wait for the British to come to them. After a heated debate, Gates, the senior officer, told Arnold to go to his room, but Arnold defied his orders, and at the Battle of Bemis Heights he charged at the British and obliterated them. Great job, Horatio. By the way, what happened to that other guy who was in Saratoga? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch. Hey George, didn't I do a great job? Taking Philadelphia and all? Didn't I? You're fired. Both Burgoyne and Howe returned to Great Britain, leaving British General Henry Clinton to take charge of the war. And the war was about to take a nasty turn, because with the victory at Saratoga, the French were finally ready to join the Americans. Alright Benny, we're in. Hey, isn't this kind of funny? You know, because you're a republic trying to overthrow an absolute monarchy, and I'm an absolute monarchy helping you? Like, could you imagine if your revolution inspired my people to revolt against me, and then they imprisoned me and all my family, and they chopped all of our heads off? Could you imagine? That's called foreshadowing. For now in America, winter was here once again, which meant yet more disease, more starvation, and even a little mutiny. After losing Philadelphia, Washington's job was again on the line, but suddenly, a Prussian guy with a very fancy name, hired by Benjamin Franklin, showed up out of nowhere and said, "Hey, I'm here to give your men a European military training." And train them he did. They learned how to shoot accurately, how to march in formation, where to poop and where not to, and strict punishments were handed out to any who didn't comply. Washington's army came out of the winter in 1778 a new and improved force, ready to take Philadelphia back from the British. In the end, though, they didn't have to. With the French entry into the war, the British ordered General Clinton to evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate all of the British forces in New York. So Washington sent Benedict Arnold to reoccupy and secure the city as he pursued the British through New Jersey on land, eventually finding a good opportunity to attack at Monmouth Courthouse. The battle took place on a sweltering hot summer's day, and as many soldiers died from heat stroke as they did from battle. In the end, after some incompetence/borderline treason from Washington's second in command, it was a draw. And in this war, a draw is kind of a victory for the Americans. Next up, let's talk about this guy. This is John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones is handsome, Scottish, and absolutely insane. When the war first broke out, everyone was like, how did the colonies expect to stand up to the might of the British Navy with their meager fleet of converted merchantmen? Yep, try telling that to John Paul Jones. This guy sailed to the British Isles, somehow captured a British ship off the coast of Ireland, and brought it back to France. Then he returned, attacking more ships, raiding towns, and evading capture the entire time. These are basically pirate tactics. But hey, if it works, it works. In one incident, he captured a British ship and returned to a Dutch port without an official ensign because his was lost during the battle. That's a big no-no and can have you arrested as a pirate. The Dutch helped him out by quickly creating a design based on Benjamin Franklin's description of what the American flag should look like, and they entered it into their records as an official US flag. What they came up with looks pretty cool. The whole campaign probably played heavily on British morale and brought into question their ability to win the war. And fun fact, he was so cool that one of the towns he raided in 1778 gave him an official honorary pardon in 1999. Keep ripping in heaven, John Paul Jones. You're an angel now. What the Continental Navy was lacking in resources, though, the French entry into the war made up for. The French began with naval skirmishes in the English Channel, and they sent a large fleet to America, although it sustained a lot of damage in a storm off Rhode Island. The Americans were hoping for a bigger commitment from the French, so John Adams went to France to help Benjamin Franklin continue negotiations. Oh good, you're finally here. Check this out. Hey ladies, I'd like to fly you like a kite, cause you're electrifying. Isn't this great? Is this what you've been doing? Yeah, why? We were sent here on a diplomatic mission to secure military support from France, not to philander with the locals. Wait, no, ladies, come back. Worst wingman ever. But the Americans would get some more help. The Dutch provided aid, although they never formed an official alliance. More significantly, though, the Spanish, who had already been providing aid, officially joined the war in June 1779. They would provide support in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, campaigns that heavily impacted the Native American tribes in those areas. Both sides actually enlisted the help of Native American tribes throughout the war, sometimes even pitting those tribes against each other. In the summer of 1779, after a series of raids against the Americans by the Iroquois, Washington organized an expedition that burned down more than 40 villages, forcing the tribes to relocate to Canada for British protection. And another group that shouldn't go unmentioned were African Americans, both free and enslaved. They joined both sides of the war, hoping to gain their freedom. But afterwards, many were simply returned to slavery, particularly those who had fought for the Americans. Despite owning slaves himself, Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but out of fear of offending the southern colonies, this was removed from the final draft. For the same reason, the American Army stopped enlisting African American men in 1775, a policy that Washington, a slave owner himself, supported. But they were forced to reverse the policy after the British promised freedom to any slaves who joined them. In general, you stood a better chance of gaining freedom if you fought for the British. However, even those that left with the British after the war suffered mistreatment and discrimination in their new lives outside of America. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is now in charge of Philadelphia, having a good time, partying down with, and even marrying a member of the Philadelphia elite. The same elite that had partied down with the British when they controlled the city. And suddenly, the people of Philadelphia, including the state governor, started accusing Arnold of having pro-British sentiments. To keep the people happy, Washington wrote a letter rebuking Arnold, calling his conduct imprudent and improper, and that was too many ouchies for Benedict Arnold to handle. He asked Washington to put him in charge of the fort at West Point. Then he contacted the British, offering to hand the plans of the fort over to them and join their side. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is our good friend no more. Luckily, the treasonous plans were discovered on a captured British officer, but Arnold managed to escape before he was arrested. As a British brigadier general, he would go on to lead raids against American cities, most notably his raid of Richmond, Virginia in 1781. His betrayal shook George Washington, who had once again set up camp at Morristown. His leadership somehow held the Continental Army together through the harshest winter of the war. We're entering 1780, and Parliament was hopping mad that the war still wasn't over. The British debt was soaring, and despite taking parts of Massachusetts in late 1779, the North was in a stalemate, so the British decided to make a major shift in strategy to the South, an economically rich area with a higher level of support for the British, or so the British thought. A year earlier, they had captured the underdefended city of Savannah, Georgia easily, and a joint American-French counter-siege failed. Now, they laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina. It fell within months, with thousands of American troops surrendering to the British, a costly defeat. The British quickly moved to take control, and they sent stereotypical Hollywood villain with a British accent Bannister the Butcher Tarleton into the backcountry, where he hunted down rebels and destroyed them with ruthless brutality. The British presence also inspired local loyalist militias in the backcountry to rise up against their persecutors. The British really seemed to be onto something with their new strategy, and the ball was very much in Washington's court. I'm gonna send my most loyal general, Nathaniel Greene, to the south to stop the British. Gonna have to overrule you there, George. We're sending hero of Saratoga and your biggest rival, Horatio Gates. Watch this, George. I'm gonna save the day again, everybody will love me, and I'm gonna get your job. Here I go. And he got into one battle with Cornwallis, got annihilated, and ran away. Alrighty, let's go with your guy. Nathaniel Greene knew the British outnumbered his own forces and wouldn't be defeated with conventional tactics, so he had to think outside the box. He split his army into two, said, "Hey big boy, look at me," and then they went running in two different directions. Cornwallis sent Tarleton after Morgan, and he caught up with him at Cowpens, where Morgan proceeded to kick Tarleton's butt. Then the two led Cornwallis on a wild chase through North Carolina, his bigger and better equipped army much heavier and slower than Greene's quick and mobile troops. Greene led Cornwallis further and further from his supply line, then crossed the Dan River into Virginia, picked up some reinforcements, and turned back to face the now exhausted British. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the two sides engaged in vicious close combat. Cornwallis, fearing loss, fired his big guns into the chaotic fighting, cutting down many of his own men. Greene retreated, giving Cornwallis the victory, but Cornwallis lost a quarter of his men in the fighting, so it felt much more like a British defeat. At this point, both sides desperately needed something to happen soon to end the fighting. The British were running out of money, while the Americans were again facing mutinies as the men went without pay or even basic living needs. Fortunately, the French were now showing up in greater numbers and were ready to fight. After his encounter with Greene, Cornwallis decided the only way to win the South was to first prevent the Southern Continental Army from using Virginia as a supply base. So he abandoned the Carolinas, moving to Wilmington and on to Yorktown, a position the British believed would be easy to supply and support. On his march to Yorktown, he raided many farms, stealing horses and supplies from the locals, but also freeing thousands of slaves, many of whom joined him. The French saw Cornwallis's new position as an opportunity to land a decisive blow on the British. Washington wanted to attack Clinton in New York, but the French said it was a really dumb idea. And to be fair, it was. Instead, Washington sent out fake dispatches to make it look like they would attack Clinton, but secretly their combined force marched all the way down to Virginia. A large French fleet under the command of Comte de Grasse arrived and successfully cleared the British Navy out of the Chesapeake Bay. The combined land and naval forces then laid siege to Cornwallis's army in Yorktown. The American and French forces tightened in around the city, raining artillery down on Cornwallis, who desperately appealed to Clinton for aid, but Clinton was unusually chilled out about the whole thing. Cornwallis held out for nearly a month before he had no choice but to surrender. Over 7,000 British troops were captured, a crushing defeat, and with that, Parliament had reached the end of its rope. The war just wasn't worth it, and it needed to end now. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but fighting between the two sides mostly ceased as peace negotiations opened up in Paris. The resulting treaty in 1783 saw Great Britain remove its troops from American soil, recognize U.S. independence, and cede territory up to the Mississippi River. In return, the Americans agreed to pay any debt still owed to Britain and gave fair treatment to any colonists who had remained loyal to the crown. The Spanish got Florida, while the French got an economic crisis that led to its own revolution a decade later. Washington retired to his home in Mount Vernon, wishing his men farewell by saying, "I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable."
With the fighting over, it makes sense that we should stop and ask how the British lost this conflict. First and foremost, they underestimated the American military situation. They underestimated the Americans' ability to find leadership and pull together to fight through this cause. Secondly, 4 commanders-in-chief over the course of the war made it really hard for the British to establish a unified strategy. It was bad for morale, and no general really exhibited the kind of charisma that was needed to win this conflict here in the colonies. Time and distance from Great Britain played a role as well. Communication and supply lines were difficult to maintain, and it was hard to maintain a message from back home. Poor political leadership was also to blame. The common people of Great Britain did not really get on board with this cause. They did not support the king, and eventually they put pressure on Parliament to bring an end to the war. Economic pressures played a role as well. Remember, the American colonies were one of Britain's biggest trading partners. Losing those trading partners meant a lot of money being lost back in Great Britain that they wanted to take care of later on. Finally, the nature of the war itself played a role. The British had to fight a civilized war. They did not want to try and create enemies here in the colonies as they fought the war. They couldn't go to the extreme ends necessary to end the war by burning down cities and those kind of things that you would do to an enemy. They had to come in and be able to govern afterwards. In addition, the Americans realized, Washington in particular realized, that the Americans did not necessarily have to win. What they had to do was not lose long enough to drag the war out and make it politically unfavorable back at home. Unfortunately, we will learn the same lesson in the 1960s in places like South Vietnam. So, take a 5-minute break, pause this video. We're going to come back and discuss the implications of the war and how America tried to govern itself with the British gone. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, British popular support and political support for the war plummeted, and Lord North resigned as Prime Minister. The House of Commons voted to end the war and sign a treaty. In September of 1783, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay negotiated the terms of the Treaty of Paris. Under the treaty, the British recognized American independence. The British gave control of the region east from the Mississippi to the Atlantic and south from Canada to Florida. These are fairly generous boundaries. The United States gained fishing rights in Newfoundland, which mattered a lot to New Englanders. And the United States agreed that they would return confiscated Loyalist property seized during the war and not punish them for supporting the British. But in the end, we have to ask, how revolutionary was this Revolutionary War? And for that, we'll ask our good friend John Green.
The war. So what did this all mean for actual people? Well, Americans like to think that we all pitched in together and got rid of British tyranny and lived happily ever after. Also that the Continental Army was the bravest, most loyal, and most effective fighting force in human history thanks to the leadership of George Washington. But actually, well, yeah, let's go to the thought bubble. Morale among Continental soldiers was often pretty low. Rations were poor and soldiers went unpaid. As Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier from Connecticut, wrote, they felt they were starving in detail for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us. And many other colonists didn't fight for independence. They fought with the British. Others were pacifists, like the Quakers, who often had their property confiscated when they refused to fight. And in colonial America, of course, losing property also meant losing rights. And for slaves, the so-called fight for freedom was very different than it was for Continental soldiers, because loyalty to Britain in the war could mean freedom. In 1775, British Governor Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that granted freedom to any slave who deserted his master and fought for the British. Something like 5,000 slaves took him up on the offer. And in addition, many slaves saw the revolution as a chance to escape. Boston King left a cruel master and later wrote, I determined to go to Charlestown and throw myself into the hands of the English. They received me readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which I knew nothing before. 100,000 slaves are estimated to have fled to the British. Now, many slaves were returned to their masters, but more than 15,000 left the U.S. when the British did. And it's worth remembering that the British Empire abolished slavery in all of its territory by 1843, and without a civil war. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Native Americans were also profoundly affected by the Revolutionary War. Generally, they wanted to stay out of it, and the colonists mostly wanted them to remain neutral too. Like the Continental Congress was eager to remind the Iroquois of their history of neutrality, writing, "This is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep." Right, well, many of the Iroquois fought for the British anyway. The Oneidas joined the Patriots fighting against the Iroquois. Sometimes there were divisions within tribes themselves. Like with the Cherokees, younger chiefs tended to side with the British, older ones with the Americans. And it should be mentioned that, unsurprisingly, American troops were particularly brutal to American Indians who fought for the British, burning their villages and enslaving prisoners contrary to the accepted rules of war. And if the American Revolution was really about, as Thomas Jefferson would have it, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then the Indians were definitely the losers because they didn't get any of those rights. So we know slaves and Native Americans didn't get much out of the Revolutionary War. How did it go for women? Yeah, not great. Some colonial women fought in the war. Deborah Sampson dressed as a man and fought at several battles, once even pulling a bullet out of her own leg. But women didn't get much out of the the Revolution, they were basically still considered wards of their husbands, or if they were unmarried, saleable assets of their fathers. However, the idea of Republican motherhood became really important. It held that for the Republic to survive, it was necessary to have a well-educated citizenry. And since women were the primary educators, they themselves needed to be educated so they could, to quote founding father Benjamin Rush, instruct their sons in the principles of liberty and government. But not vote or own property. So the war didn't end slavery, it didn't much change the roles of women, and it didn't displace the elite, land-owning, pasty, white guy leadership of America. So what was revolutionary? Well, the ideas, a lot of which are summed up in a single sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when the colonies became states, they all created constitutions which opened voting to more people. While most states still had property qualifications for voting, the bar was lowered, so there were far more voters than there had been, although they were mostly white and male. But still, another aspect of the American Revolution that was pretty revolutionary was the beginning of true religious freedom. Like with independence, the Church of England ceased to be the Church of America. And some founders, like Thomas Jefferson, were deists, believing that God had created the world, but then stepped away to create other universes or try to build a boulder too big for him to lift. Jefferson called for a wall of separation between church and state that's best embodied in the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia, which Jefferson was so proud of that he had it mentioned on his tombstone. And the American Revolution profoundly changed the economy too. All these new ideas of liberty led to a decline in apprenticeship and indentured servitude, and immediately after the war you began to see the split between the North with its reliance on paid labor and the South with its reliance on slavery. Slavery was actually on the decline in the South until Eli Whitney went and invented the cotton gin in 1793, which A, made it possible to turn a profit growing inferior American cotton, and B, reinvigorated slavery. Yay, innovation. Oh no, it's time for the mystery document. The rules are simple. Mystery document, get it wrong. Shock pen, get it right. Woo! An equality of property, constantly operating to destroy combinations of powerful families, is the very soul of a republic. While this continues, the people will inevitably possess both power and freedom. When this is lost, power departs, liberty expires, and a commonwealth will inevitably assume some other form. Let the people have property, and they will have power, a power that will forever be exerted to prevent a restriction of the press and the abolition of trial by jury or the abridgment of any other privilege. Stan, why did you put communism in my mystery document? All right, so we got a fan of wealth distribution, but it isn't Marx because A, he's not American, B, he wasn't born. There were a bunch of far-left hippies in early America with their hemp growing and their liberty espousing. Oh, I hate the shock pen. All right, I'm gonna guess that it is noted lexicographer Noah Webster. Yes! 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 Nailed it! Yes! Stan, that was the best one ever. That was my biggest victory to date. So it's worth remembering that some early Americans proposed a vision of liberty that sprung out of the idea of equality of property, which is very different from the way we imagine liberty today. But ideas of liberty, as diverse as they were, are really at the heart of what makes the American Revolution revolutionary. And that brings us back to slavery. The most common complaint among American high school students is that the revolution was deeply hypocritical. I mean, how could this guy write that all men were created equal when he himself held slaves and had kids with one of them? And even crazier, American colonists often referred to themselves as slaves because they were denied the right to have a vote in Parliament about their taxation. Now, some people recognize that it was a smidge hypocritical to claim to be enslaved by British taxation while they themselves were actually enslaving people. But very few made the leap to say that liberty should mean freedom for the slaves. One exception was James Otis of Massachusetts, who wrote concerning America's slaves that unless they were free, there could be no liberty. What man is or ever was born free, if every man is not? But most of the founders, including this guy and this guy, were the cream of the colonial elites, and so they held slaves and made arguments against abolition. Like many historians now argue that Jefferson was trying to condemn slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but without slavery, he wouldn't have had his amazing life. I mean, if he'd been working, he couldn't have designed Monticello or stolen all those ideas from John Locke. And speaking of Locke, Locke equated liberty with property, and a revolution based on securing property against tyranny couldn't very well turn turn around and take slaves who, after all, were considered property. I mean, Jefferson once calculated that his slaves gave him a better financial return than his real estate investments. That being said, there were many and frequent protests against slavery. The most vociferous protesters were often African Americans, and in the northern states at least, their pleas were heard. Between 1777 and 1804, all states north of Maryland got rid of slavery, although most did so at a very slow pace and were careful not to deprive slave owners of the value of their property. Like, as late as 1830, there were still about 3,500 slaves in the North, and on the eve of the Civil War, there were still 18 in New Jersey. New Jersey! So the number of free people of color in the U.S. skyrocketed. There were fewer than 10,000 in 1776. By 1810, there were nearly 200,000 free black Americans. So in the end, real change came, as it usually does, not through a revolutionary event, but through a revolutionary process. To me, the really novel idea that emerged from the American Revolution was of American equality. Now, obviously, this was and remains a vastly unequal social order, but I'm talking about the kind of equality that Gordon Wood described in his famous book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. The idea that no one American is inherently better than any other. Prior to the Revolution, and certainly in Europe, there were definite classes of superior people, usually determined by birth. I mean, people knew their place and they were expected to be deferential to their betters. But all that talk of freedom and inalienable rights introduced the idea that birth wasn't destiny and that all people should be treated with respect. And the idea that no one should be denied the opportunity to succeed because of who their parents were catalyzed change not just in America, but around the world. And while the US no longer leads in equality of opportunity, that early American idea that we are all equal in our capacity to reason and to work became the foundation not just for the American Revolution, but for many others that would come afterward. Thanks for watching.
So America is now independent, and a new society and new nation is taking form. That new nation will be governed under the Articles of Confederation, a document created during the American Revolutionary War to serve as the first constitution. Here to explain what the AOC was like is the savior of all historical videos, Random British Guy.
With independence now declared and the British Empire booted as the governing body of the colonies, there was an immediate need for a document that established an American government. While most people think that the Constitution was the first such document, this is false. The Constitution would not be ratified and established until 1788. America's first attempt at a government was based on a document called the Articles of Confederation. Even before any independence was declared or any articles were written, leaders of the colonies knew they were going to need a government in place immediately. Ben Franklin several times proposed documents establishing intercolonial collaboration, including during the Albany Congress in 1754. Out of fear of a centralized government due to their experience with the British Empire, colony leaders shot this proposal down. The suspicion of a centralized government became a theme in the Articles of Confederation that eventually led to its downfall and its replacement by the Constitution as the new nation's governing document. On July 12, 1776, a mere 8 days after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, a committee led by John Dickinson, former president of both Delaware and Pennsylvania, submitted a draft of the Articles of Confederation. Despite the need for speed, the Continental Congress took over a year to debate, rewrite, and fight over what should be in the document. Many in the Congress feared centralized government and having too much influence in the hands of too few. The power of each individual state became a hot-button issue, plus how votes should be divided amongst the states. Many argued that states with larger populations, or ones that had given the most money to the national treasury, should have more votes, while others wished that each state be given one equal vote, no matter the size. After settling on these issues, the final draft of the Articles of Confederation was ready for ratification on November 15, 1777. It would not be completely ratified until 1781, with Maryland finally signing off on it on February 22nd, but it was used as the de facto system of government beginning in late 1777. The Articles of Confederation asked each state to enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, but it was different from the Constitution in a few significant ways. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government consisted of only a one-house, unicameral legislative branch. There were no executive, president, or judicial Supreme Court branches. Delegates to Congress were appointed by state legislatures, not voted upon by the public. Each state had only one vote, appeasing smaller states who feared that bigger states would hold more power in the newly formed country. Most significant Significantly, though, any power that was not specifically granted in the Articles of Congress was left to the individual states. It was no coincidence that slavery was not mentioned at all in the Articles of Confederation. The law of slavery was left at the discretion of each individual state. The Articles did allow for Congress to declare war, deal in foreign policy, print and coin money, run the military, though the troops must come from the states, and negotiate Native American affairs. To many citizens of the time, these were the most important issues that they expected their government to deal with, but the lack of a truly centralized national government began to take its toll. States regularly had conflicts with one another over commerce, varying business interests, and matters of state-run militia. There was no leadership, no one power source to make determinations in these cases. Civil war amongst the states was a constant underlying threat. In addition, Congress did not have the power to tax. The states determined their own taxes, thus leaving the new government broke and its currency nearly worthless.
As you can see, the government under the AOC was rife with problems. It's easy for us to judge the AOC now as a fatally flawed document, but you have to put it in the context of the time period. This was an overreaction to the complaints lodged by the Declaration of Independence. They did not want to give the new government the same kind of powers that the old government that they rebelled against had had before. So they made the government deliberately weak. It was not, however, all doom and gloom. The government under the AOC was able to handle one of the thorniest issues of the day, the issue of Western lands. When Great Britain ceded the land to the United States between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, some states just claimed that land as their own. That was a problem because some states were able to pay off their debts by selling off that Western land, while other states had no Western land and therefore still had significant economic issues back home. The government solved this by federalizing all of that land. The land gained by the Revolutionary War would be shared by the entire country. In addition, they passed the Land Ordinance of 1785. This land ordinance allowed for the orderly survey of the land, the breakup of the land into smaller townships, and set the process by which the federal government could sell that land and keep the profit to help pay off debt and fund the government. Beyond that, they also passed the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance set forth the process by which that territory could be integrated as states into the Union. It also set up the process by which the territories would be governed until they became states, and it banned slavery north of the Ohio River. The government still had serious problems. They had borrowed money to pay for the war and had no means to pay it back. American ships were barred from trading with the West Indies because the same navigation acts that said that the colonies could not trade outside of Great Britain now applied to us as outside of Great Britain. Furthermore, American ships no longer had the protection of the British Navy. Imported goods were flooding American markets and draining money out of the country. States were supposed to take care of themselves, so they adopted their own economic policies like printing money and passing laws postponing debt collection and imposing tariffs on goods from each other. So there were serious economic problems facing the country. One of the biggest issues was the conflict between debtors and creditors. The wealthy complained that state governments were pandering to commoners by offering to relieve debt at their expense. Commoners were upset that farmers were losing their farms because debt collectors were coming in and taking their property. This came to a head in 1786 in Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran. He and other farmers in western Massachusetts rebelled against tax collectors coming in from the cities. They also wanted to make sure that farmers did not lose their farms, many of them being Revolutionary War veterans, to debt collectors. So Shays gathered together a militia and started closing down courthouses in western Massachusetts to prevent foreclosure hearings from being able to happen. The state government couldn't do anything about it because, well, they had no militia. Shays was the militia. Eventually, they had to bring in a privately funded militia paid for in part by creditors in Boston. This militia prevented Shays and his followers from seizing the weapons cache at Springfield, Massachusetts, and put the rebellion down. But with that said, many people of the time period saw this as an extension of the values of the revolution, while others saw this as the beginning of mob rule, or ochlocracy. Conservatives in particular were spurred to action. They called for a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in September of that year. Delegates from 6 states met in Maryland to talk about ways to ensure that interstate trade and international commerce could be better. They submitted recommendations to Congress asking for a national convention with all states present to amend the Articles of Confederation. That meeting would take place in Philadelphia the following year and would become known as the Constitutional Convention. And we'll pick up there later on this week.